PT24, driving business.
Now let's look at the electricity sector reforms. In Uganda, 51% of the population does not have access to electricity despite living between 0 and 1.5 kilometers from the grid. The Electric Act Cap 145 was proposed to be amended in order to clear up legal ambiguities and add flexibility to its application, as well as improving the efficiency of the electricity industry. The amendment represents progress in the effort to improve service delivery in the nation. Rodan Ahabwe reports.
Today, the Electricity Regulatory Authority has launched the Electricity Amendment Act that was passed by Parliament in May 2022. The key objectives of this act were to remove the single monopoly that were held by UEDCL and UETCL as the single suppliers and sellers of electricity in Uganda. In this story, we also analyze how hefty the penalties of power vandalism are. Electricity Regulatory Authority says that consultations are being made to ensure that this act doesn't marginalize anyone. However, additional sources point out that the tariff would undoubtedly decrease. So how does this open market influence consumers?
The regulation that operationalizes that amendment. So we are in the process of putting in place the regulations. We already at draft stage. And we are consulting various stakeholders to have their input in this regulation to ensure that once it is finalized, it meets the expectation of all players. The regulation is supposed to be made in such a way that it does not discriminate any customers, that it is fair to all customers that are consuming at the same voltage and at the same level of consumption.
The law that also establishes deterrent penalties for energy theft and electrical equipment damage is what has caused the current spike in cases, particularly in Kampala metropolitan area, including in Soba, Mulago, Kawempe, Kisenyi, New Tax Park, Old Tax Park, Lusanja and Kasangati, Kaja Zone, Bweyogerere, Najana Nkumbi and Chiseka Market. Powerline vandalism costs taxpayers about 260 billion shillings, but Electricity Regulatory Authority is working with police to leverage technological innovation to combat this violence.
Government opens up the monopoly in transmission. It means that the transmission grid, which is supposed to move power from the generation plants, is going to go across the country, and so everywhere you have the stability of a stronger network that takes a ring across the country. What does that mean for the Ugandan, for the final consumer? It means there's going to be one stability in supply, apart from vandals. A transmission grid is not affected with these common things like lightning and those little things and trees falling and so on. But two, it's also going to improve on access. Okay, it's going to accelerate access. That means that electricity can be taken comfortably across the country because there is a major grid from whom distribution taps across.
When looking back at Uganda's initial electricity sector reforms, it is also important to note that Umeme, the only distribution company, joined the effort after the only other serious bidder gave up trying to acquire the UEBD's distribution assets due to the poor state of infrastructure and widespread power thefts, as well as technical losses discovered during the diligence on the Uganda Electricity Board grid. One could argue that the original Umeme owners, who were paristotles in their own countries, that is to say South Africa and the United Kingdom, were doing a favor for a struggling friendly country at the time.
How do we keep law and order in a country which has reached the peak of us to engage in socio-economic transformation? Now, just to reflect a little, for you to expand your economic base, for you to advance the survival of your people, there are many things you must do. But most importantly, I'll give you an example. You must have an investment plan. You must support investments in the country so that you can raise revenue which can be able to transform the lives of your people. Now, think about it. Is it possible for you to invest when you don't have power, when some rogues in our society are busy bringing down all the infrastructure which has been built with taxpayers' money? That's $1 million question for us to reflect on.
Rona Nahabwe, Smart 24 TV, Business Today.
All right, now, away from that, let's look at more of what is coming in from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, meeting the non-government organization leaders. The Ministry of Internal Affairs has contributed with the Non-Government Organization Bureau to conduct the quarterly discussion meeting with the NGO leaders and the Human Rights Center, Uganda, on issues affecting the performance of the sector. Now, the major problem cited so far is lack of financing and revenue. We have more in this report.
The NGO Bureau is required by the NGO Act of 2006 to plan these gatherings so that many stakeholders can gather and have a discussion. The NGO is a useful supplement to the government in many respects. Honorable David Muhoz, the Minister of State for Internal Affairs, assured NGOs of the government's cooperation and provided information of the future.
What we want to assure you that we shall get to the bottom of it and ensure that it doesn't recur. And I wouldn't want to say that you are, by inference, you mean that the break-ins were by government. Certainly not. But whoever it was will be found out, and then also to ensure that going forward we don't have such occurrences, and also to smoothen our relationship with the NGO sector. As you heard from the commitments we have, there could have been some challenges on either side. And what better way to resolve them than to have such a dialogue annually, but also the other measures that are in the offing by government and between government and the NGO sector, including that DGF, where we have made a lot of headway in resolving our issues that we had. We had issues as government, they had issues, and I think we've found space to talk about them and seek solutions.
Many challenges are affecting the sector, among which taxation and miscommunication between local leaders and NGO directors are the main problems.
No, the other issues, one is under the tax-related issues, where they requested for a separate meeting between NGO Bureau and the Revenue Authority plus the sector. That is yet going to take place. They also requested for a one-stop center. The NGOs are pushing for more tax exemption on so many of the things that they're doing, and so we need to sit down with the Revenue Authority because they feel the taxes are affecting so many of the operations. So until we have that engagement, we cannot conclude on that issue.
It's that people condemn NGOs without knowledge, but the fact is, when you look at the social sector, it is heavily subsidized by NGOs, and government actually appreciates that. You go to ministries, departments and agencies that appreciate the work of NGOs, but when you go to certain individuals, they hide their heads in the sand, and we want that to be known, and that is what the space is offering us. Unfortunately, there are many who are out there who seem not to understand or choose not to understand the role of NGOs and misinform different stakeholders who do not come to these spaces. And my plea here today was, can we regionalize these meetings? Can we take them to different regions? Can we get spaces where we get these other stakeholders together, like RDCs, security agencies, NIRA, other stakeholders to come into this place?
NGOs place a strong emphasis on fostering community empowerment and local capacity building. Their strategy is to build up local mechanisms and strong local relationships, assist and guarantee the sustainability of locally driven development and humanitarian solutions. Desire Nambiru, Smart 24 TV, Business Today.
And now let's look at the funds for people with disabilities. The government obtained more cash for special grants for people with disabilities, as the government has established two levels of implementation of the special grant as the national level special grant and the local government special grant, which is the LSG. Now, the LSG, which is the national level special grant, includes a budget-specified source envelope that will be managed by the local government special grant as well. Now, on the other hand, districts, municipalities, and the cities will be in charge of managing the local government special grant. We have more of this report, courtesy of Martha Nimsiba.
The government instituted 2 levels of implementation of the special grant as the National Level Special Grant (NSG) and the Local Government Special Grant (LSG). The NSG includes a budget-specified resource envelope that will be managed by the MGLSD. On the other hand, the LSG will be managed by districts, municipalities, and cities. The 10% allocated for persons with disabilities is under PDM and is to help them achieve sustainable growth, a healthy livelihood, and they are to receive this money through their circles. People with disabilities also requested to have adjustments in the special grant allocated to them by the government. This was done and the amount was put in the national budget of this financial year.
Persons with disabilities requested to be allocated a specific ceiling under the parish development model program as an affirmative action. To this end, persons with disabilities were allocated 10% of the PDM funds, and they can now access these funds through their PDM circles. Persons with disabilities also requested for an increment in the allocation of the National Special Grant for Persons with Disabilities to at least 17 billion to cater for the 31 local governments that had not benefited from the grant. I am pleased to report that the budget for the program was enhanced from Uganda shillings 9.6 billion to Uganda shillings 16.6 billion in the financial year 2022-2023.
The minister also emphasized that these funds are only intended for those who have disabilities and that they are intended to support their access to employment, training, and their livelihoods in order to prevent the perpetuation of poverty and powerlessness and to advance the welfare of people with disabilities by generating income for national development.
I'm talking about special grant is a grant given to government to support the economic empowerment of people with disabilities. This is specific for only persons with disabilities. The other one is more of an inclusion program, but this one is our specific program.
The government wants to enhance the lives of people with disabilities. Thus, this money, which is never returned, is used to build enterprises, jobs, and other sources of income.
The government not only raises awareness of the significance of encouraging equality and the full involvement of people with disabilities in social life, but also recognizes the ability of people with disabilities to contribute to the growth of the nation. People with disabilities will also benefit from these programs by having stable employment. According to Uganda Bureau of Statistics 2016, for the population aged 2 years and above, the disability prevalence rate was 12.4%, which translates approximately 6 million people. Of these, 49.26% and 50.74% are males and females respectively. The census estimated that the highest forms of disability were difficulty in seeing, 6.5% of the population, difficulty in remembering, 5.4%, difficulty in walking, 4.5%, and difficulty in hearing, 3.1%. Martha Nimsima, Smart 24 TV, Business Today.
Well, now, when you look at the Central Bank in their financial stability assessment report that apparently was released, cited that the rising international commodity prices and the global supply disruptions have contributed to global and domestic inflation. So our discussion in the Coffee Court is rotating around the same issue tonight. Let's have more of that.
Well, my pleasure. This time around, we will be discussing issues of Bank of Uganda. My name is Fred Makuya, and welcome to this Coffee Court, where we digest matters of national importance. Joining me is the director in charge of supervision. This is none other than Dr. Tumwebeine, of course, definitely from Bank of Uganda. Doctor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
First and foremost, bring us to speed on what is your role, first of all, as Bank of Uganda, even before we dive into your particular area of document.
Well, Bank of Uganda, looking at what was provided for in the Constitution under the Bank of Uganda Act, Bank of Uganda is responsible for largely two things: maintaining price stability, managing inflation, and maintaining financial sector stability, because we are also the regulator and supervisor for the banking sector, both deposit-taking institutions and non-deposit-taking institutions. Yes.
And what do you mean by non-deposit and non-deposit? What exactly are you...
So, for financial institutions, the banking sector has got a wide number of participants and actors. So there are institutions that by law and by their license that we give them are allowed to take deposits from the public, but make them available to the public on demand and create credit or lend them the funds out, and therefore provide a financial intermediation service between the providers of funds and the users of funds. Now, non-bank are institutions which are not necessarily deposit taking. I'll give an example. Forex bureaus. Forex bureaus don't take deposits, but we regulate them. Money remittance companies, which receive money on behalf of individuals and pass it on, with a promise to pass it on. Those don't take deposits. Okay? And even amongst the deposit-taking institutions, we have categories. So we have tier 1s, we have tier 2s, tier 3s. And they are all differentiated by what kind of services they can provide and what kind of services they can provide. Okay. And again, the different tiers also categorize in terms of which demographics they provide their services to. So tier 1s will provide general banking services. Tier 2s tend to look at more of the bottom of the pyramid in terms of the kind of services they provide. So tier 1s, for example, will not be able to access to liquidity facilities at the Bank of Uganda, or tier 3s, but tier 1s do. So there's a whole categorization of financial institutions, both deposit-taking and non-deposit-taking, and these details are also provided on our website in terms of understanding the different classes of financial institutions that we regulate.
Okay.
That's one. That's about regulating the financial sector, supervising it, and therefore ensuring that it is always stable. As the Director of Financial Stability was talking earlier on today, maintaining financial stability is a core mandate and resort decree for the existence of Bank of Uganda. The second function for Bank of Uganda is on managing price stability, and of course there is the issuance and the management of currency. So Bank of Uganda is the only agency in this country that's allowed to, one, print, distribute, manage the country's currency.
You've talked about the stability of prices. Do we have stable prices now as we talk?
Now, price stability in many words is basically inflation. So from 2000, I believe it was 2000, I can't remember the year, but about more than 10 years ago, Bank of Uganda adopted something called the inflation targeting framework. So what we do because price stability is reflected in inflation. When inflation is rising, that means there's a bit of instability in the prices. So what we do is that we have, under the ITF inflation targeting framework, we set a target for inflation beyond which we try, whatever, if the inflation goes beyond that level, we then use the existing tools within our toolkit to bring inflation down to below target. So we have a target for inflation, and we make sure that we try and keep prices below that, or price rises below that. Yes.
This time around, we've increased the inflation for more than once or twice.
No, we didn't increase inflation. What we did was that we increased the central bank reference rate slightly, and that's one of the tools we have available to us to manage inflation. And I know those who are listening are probably wondering, how does that work? So when we increase the CBR, the central bank reference rate, the central bank reference rate is the short-term rate at which Bank of Uganda lends money to commercial banks. Short-term, normally about a maximum of a week. Okay? When banks have, in the course of banks conducting their business, taking deposits, lending, sometimes there's a mismatch in terms of you receive a deposit, you lend it out, the person who brought the deposit comes back tomorrow and wants some of the money, so you must have liquidity. So it's for banks, as the banks manage their liquidity, we put in place facilities to enable banks manage their liquidity so that they can keep on providing that financial intermediation role. The rate at which they borrow that money, that's short-term money, is the central bank reference rate. And by adjusting it we also get to influence the price at which banks lend.
Okay.
Now, when the CBR goes up, it means essentially what we're doing is that we are increasing the price at which banks would be lending. When the lending prices go up, the demand for credit goes down. With a depressed demand for credit, fewer people borrowing, there is presumably we are lowering demand we generate within the economy. And when you reduce demand, okay, in the place where when demand comes down, supply has to come down too. Or if supply remains high and demand comes down, prices adjust downwards, and that's how we bring down inflation.
So don't you think you leave us in a very hard situation? Your role is to set the pace, but you leave us in a situation where commercial banks is at liberty to set whatever prices they want.
Yes, because you see, we operate in a free market dispensation. Okay? If you go to a bank and they offer you a rate you don't like, move to another bank. And the pricing should always be demand. Pricing is an equilibrium setting process, right? Depending on the demand for loans and the supply of funds, the way you match the two is how you arrive at the price of credit. Of course, considering there are many other things that get into the decision also. You look at things like creditworthiness of borrowers, the quality and issues around enforcement of collateral. You look around things I was talking about, information asymmetry, that when you stand in front of a lender, how can he or she objectively assess or determine your creditworthiness? Because in the lending decision, there are two things that come into consideration. One, there is capacity to repay, but there's also willingness to repay. A number of times we've had situations where people demonstrate capacity to repay, but the willingness to repay becomes a problem. So then when the banks are pricing, they take into consideration all these things. And then of course there's the operating costs.
So where do you come in at this point? There is willingness to pay, but the capacity is a different thing.
So because banks have developed more than adequate capacity, they have the adequate skill set and resources to evaluate capacity to repay. The issue, the information asymmetry between borrowers and lenders has been largely around the willingness to repay. In other words, there are no consequences to someone not demonstrating their willingness to repay. When someone dishonors, when you have a loan contract and you don't honor it, borrowers have been able to work around that without penalty for their infractions. When you enter into a binding contract, it places obligations on you, the borrower, but also obligations on the lender. If the lender fulfills his obligations, you as the borrower are also compelled to fulfill your obligations. Now when you don't, then you cause a distortion. And this is and the way banks deal with that distortion, because it ends up turning into a loss, is going forward, they then price higher for that uncertainty, that risk of default.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I have issues with my bank, where do you come in as Bank of Uganda, maybe, to come and to help and sustain the bank?
Now, when you have issues with your bank, because that's a contractual relationship, okay? That's when you go to a bank, you open an account. If you read the forms, they specify obligations. Bank of Uganda issued the Financial Consumer Empowerment Guidelines, I think 2011, 2013? 2013. And when you read those, they are very clear in terms of what your obligations are as a customer of a bank, and also what the obligations are as the bank, as the provider of services to you. Okay? Now, should you have a misunderstanding, like in any relationship, should you have a misunderstanding, we expect you to first try and get it addressed by the financial institution. Only when they provide you a solution you're not comfortable with, or they resolve it in a manner you don't like, do you then come to us. So you should think of Bank of Uganda as dealing with second-level complaints. You have an issue with your bank, first try and sort it out with them. When you fail, then we have a whole consumer affairs unit under our communications department that deals with those kind of complaints.
Maybe as we plan to sign out, what is your final remark conclusively as we plan to even to end there?
Remark on
your final conclusion. I know issues of Bank of Uganda cannot be discussed in a single day.
No, I think my final remark would be that as we all consume financial services, I think we should take care and be a bit more careful that we do not sign or append our signatures to things we don't understand. And that the relationship you have as a customer with your bank is a contractual relationship. So every party has obligations. And as a supervisor, when the bank fails to meet its contractual obligations, then we come in. But the other question is, when you, the consumer, fail to meet your contractual obligations, what is the recourse for the bank?
Maybe that will be a discussion for another day. Director, thank you for sparing time to speak to us. Of course, that is it from the Executive Director of Supervision, Bank of Uganda, Mr. Tumubweine Twinemanzi, and this is the Coffee Court. My name is Fred Makubia.
And that is it for the Coffee Court tonight. Thank you very much for sticking to Smart 24 TV's Business Today. I'm Jerome Paul Sonko and Winnie Wiyinza Nakochi on Sign Language. Have yourselves a blessed night. Till tomorrow, good evening.